Hello, how are you?
Hey, I am doing quite well. My family is scattered all over. My wife and youngest son are at the coast, and they are working with a camp of kids with disabilities and their families. And I'm super excited that they get to go and do that together with our church. And yeah, my son is resting after a long day at work. My daughter ran off to go see a friend. And anyway, I'm just hanging out here with no responsibilities and recording with you. How are you?
That's amazing. I'm doing great. My kids and I had dinner tonight, and over the last couple of months, I have been trying to successfully cook really great ribs on the grill.
Ooh.
And 4.5 stars out of 5 tonight, ladies and gentlemen.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was good.
Wow.
I am no grill master, so I'm sure somebody else's would be significantly better. But man, cooking them for a really long time on the top rack and putting tin foil under them so that the drippings didn't cause fire and result in like them getting charred. Ooh, they were so good. Best ribs I've ever made.
All right. Man, I wish I were having dinner with you in Missouri. That sounds lovely.
Oh, it was so good, but sadly it is over.
Yeah. Oh, over is a great little segue because today
I was trying. That was intentional.
Oh, dang. Jeez.
I was trying to set it up.
This is what happens when you get the topic in advance.
Yeah, sadly, it is over.
Okay. And that brings us to the end times, ladies and gentlemen.
Ooh, did you want to talk about the end times today? I had no idea.
Nobody believes you.
At least my daughter would say that is probably wise.
Yeah, so we are knee-deep in our Revelation study. I cannot believe that this is the 5th and final book that we had agreed to read together on this topic.
Yeah. And sort of a book that I don't know that I want to say comes a little bit out of left field in a series on Revelation, but it felt a little that way to me.
Well, yeah, it's very different than all of the other books we've studied because oddly enough, we've gotten to this point in our conversation and we have not talked about the rapture. We have not talked about the millennial reign. We have not talked about the importance of Israel. Like, we've not talked about, quote unquote, the end times yet.
Exactly. And this book, which is officially titled The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation, by Daniel G. Hummel, is such a fascinating read after having gone through all the other various books that we've read about the book of Revelation.
Yeah, it really is. And I'm so glad we started with the other books because I think if you remember back to our very first Revelation episode, which is oddly enough more recent for our audience than it is for us because we recorded it so long ago. Yep. But we said, hey, we've got to start here with a book called Reading Revelation Responsibly because of all the baggage we carry around these conversations around, quote unquote, the end times. And it was enlightening to read this book and realize where all of that baggage came from. And all those words that I mentioned just a moment ago about rapture and Israel and all of this stuff, these are not words that you find in Revelation. And yet everybody thinks that's what you're going to find in Revelation. In fact, these are words that are associated with a very distinct theological slant that had its heyday and is no longer in its heyday, and yet we're all affected by it. And that theological slant is dispensationalism.
Yeah. So before we jump into the way that dispensationalism impacted reading Revelation for at least a generation, let's at least catch up on what the book told us about the history of dispensationalism as a movement So, can you start off by just kind of giving a quick summary of your sense of where dispensationalism came from?
Yeah, this is really fascinating because the history of dispensationalism, to me, why this is important and why I think I agree with you, we should start here, is because what dispensationalism started with and the baggage that I carry today are cousins, but they are not the same thing. And
Mm,
I found it really interesting in this book, and Hummel does just an amazing job in this book.
so good.
Yes. And so, what do I mean by amazing? He was not reactionary, right? He's a historian relating a historical narrative of a theological position. All of its origins, all of its influences, all of its main proponents, all of its main actors and people who kind of morphed it and why. And he did an amazing job. And what I learned about dispensationalism is that it was a very unique theology that really has its roots with is it John Nelson Darby? Was that his middle
I
name?
think so. Yep, I
John
think so.
Darby, back in like the 1850s or something like that in England. And he goes on, like he really cares about certain things, particularly this idea that God is going to treat Israel different than it treats the church. And he has kind of two tracks going on here. There's kind of this heavenly track that the church is on and the earthly track that Israel is on. And that really matters to him and how he sees prophecy playing out. And he forms a kind of a group of people that are like-minded and start is it the Plymouth Brethren or just the Brethren?
Plymouth Brethren, I think.
And so that ends up transmitting over to the United States at some point, particularly in the Great Lakes area. And then it starts getting attached to weird Americanisms and it just kind of morphs until, it's more like the early 1900s when somebody actually finally says, hey, we'll call this dispensationalism. And by that point, it's almost unrecognizable from where it started. And yet it still has some theological affinity to where it started. That's my rough sketch, but I think you had some ideas as to really what were salient points about its origins.
Yeah, I was really struck, first of all, as you said, the way this is a UK movement that starts with John Nelson Darby, but this idea that it ultimately is named after, that God worked in different ways at different points in history. This is so emblematic to me of the way the whole dispensational movement over the last 150 years has worked, that I just want to pause for one moment on this idea. Because the idea that God works at different times in different ways throughout history, meaning in the Old Testament, he worked in one particular way with Israel, and in the New Testament, he works in a different way with the church. Generally speaking, if you say that to most people who are following Jesus, who have read their Bibles, they're going to be like, yeah, of course.
Mm,
But
right.
what it appears to me that dispensationalism did is take that truth and try to get overly specific about it. Let's get really, really clear. Are those the only two times God worked differently, or did he work differently? Well, no, because he worked differently with Adam. That was clearly a different thing. So Adam's number one. So then what's number two? Is Noah number two? Like, is Adam to Noah kind of era number two? Is it? So you can see where by asking the question, let's get specific about this, it would force you to identify a series of what now ended up being called dispensations. And I think that sense of let's rigidly clarify becomes one of the problematic elements of the theological model.
Yes. Yeah. And honestly, late in dispensationalism history, they take some of those really hard lines and they start to soften them. And they soften them to what's called progressive dispensationalism. And even the opponents of dispensationalism are going, well, guys, you're not even talking dispensationalism anymore. You're almost speaking our language about covenants and the way God has orchestrated his movement over time, but he hasn't changed who he is or what he's trying to accomplish or anything like that. And, so dispensationalism itself softened those lines, and then it really just kind of dissolved. And that's not the only way in which it dissolved. There were a whole host of things that happened, but you're right. It's that hyper literalism or that hyper categorization that really defined dispensationalism.
Well, and that on top of, if we're shifting a little bit here from history, which I think we need to come back to in a couple of moments here because we're missing some pieces of the story. But if we're looking at kind of the theological essentials, this is one that really struck me, was this idea of there are different dispensations of time in which God works differently with different groups of people. That wasn't the only distinctive of dispensationalism. And so I'm curious, if that's the one that really hit me the strongest, what of the distinctives of dispensationalism really struck you?
Yeah, we've vaguely hit on a couple of them already, but they have a very literal reading of Scripture. And in fact, that's kind of one of the hallmarks of dispensationalism is this literal hermeneutic or literal way of reading the Bible. And so everything has to have a literal meaning, no figurative language ever. And I get where they're coming from, right? We don't really want to just trash on the Bible and make everything allegory and, it can mean anything. No, it has to mean what it was intended to mean. But sometimes it was meant to be allegorical. And so, I think we have to apply some discernment that, no, the author was actually using an allegory. It's okay to understand it allegorically. So I think that's one distinctive. But the one that really stands out to me is something I think we still fall prey to in many evangelical circles, and it's this idea of free grace. And when I say that, I imagine our astute Bible listeners are going, yeah, didn't Paul call grace free? What's the problem with that? And yes, it is, but I think the free grace mentality was much more about all you have to do is assent to these theological beliefs or say the sinner's prayer, and that's it. It really watered down discipleship. It watered down what it was we were really doing by committing our lives to Christ. And it really didn't speak anything about apprenticing ourselves to Jesus, which is the definition of Christian that we have been using on this podcast. And so it kind of made it just cheap, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say, cheap grace. And I think that that's problematic. And I think we still fall prey to that because I think we do look at passages like, in Romans and talk about, oh, well, grace is free. It's a free gift and there's no strings attached. And that is true, but you need to know what you're entering into. It's not just, fire insurance, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, and honestly, I'm struck by the way these two elements of dispensationalism fed into one another. If you take what you first were talking about, this idea of literal reading of the text, it was even narrower than just literal reading of the text. It was the plain, obvious literal meaning of the text that sort of almost implied whatever an idiot would read in this text, that's what it means. Right. You shouldn't have to think too hard about it. So if you start with that starting point and you read in Romans 10, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. What's the plain literal meaning of that? It's only one thing that's required. You got to believe and say, mental assent. And I think both of these are deeply dangerous. and we have to be really careful. And they, on the positive side, I think they gave rise to some of the great evangelistic preachers throughout a variety of eras, from D.L. Moody to Billy Sunday to Billy Graham.
Right.
I mean, dispensationalism as a movement, because it emphasized the end of the current dispensation through the return of Jesus any minute now, pushed for a, hey, let's introduce people to the gospel right now. This may literally be their last moment. And there's something really beautiful about that simplicity. But the negative side is exactly what you're saying. All right. All we have to do with these crowds of people is get them to say a 12-word prayer, and they've gotten saved. And you can see the consequences of this when genuinely faithful believers hear a variety of politicians who have figured this formula out, who can get into the evangelical world because they can claim mental assent. Therefore, they're in the camp, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Jesus was railing against the religious leaders of his own day. And so it wasn't necessarily quote unquote Christians that he was railing against, but the mentality of like, well, I'm Israel because I've always been Israel, or I'm Israel because I have the scriptures, or I'm Israel because I know who Yahweh is, and Yahweh is my national God. Therefore, I'm in with Yahweh. He broke that down, and I think Paul even broke that down over and over and over. So I agree with you. I think it's a dangerous mentality, but it's deceptively simple, and it feels true on its surface.
And that gives, for me, that is one of the deep concerns I have about this, is this idea that Hummel kept referring to. And I don't know if this is his phrase or if this was an actual phrase that was used, but the idea of pop dispensationalism. So
Yes.
there were a series of very intelligent biblical scholars who were seeking to understand the Bible and ask some of those early questions I mentioned about when that various dispensations were and how did God act differently and what does the Bible tell us about these things. And one of the points that I had never heard but that Hummel makes is that there is a significant divorce between this academic dispensationalism and the pop dispensationalism that is kind of symbolized in Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth, right? That sold millions of copies. And
right.
You recently read this, right? Late great Planet Earth?
Yeah. So I like I said, there's so much baggage around Revelation because of pop dispensationalism. And when I saw, like, as I'm reading this book and we get toward the end where dispensationalism as an academic field of study and a theological discipline suddenly breaks into the mainstream and disconnects itself from all academic rigor, that's the moment where this becomes a cultural moment. And it's what has influenced me in my life and my upbringing, and honestly, my revulsion of studying Revelation. I have ignored this book ever since. So when I get to this end of Hummel's book, and he says, look, this is the book that launched from academic dispensationalism to pop dispensationalism. The hinge point is Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. And from that point forward, people realize, oh, there's a market for this, and we don't have to follow the academics anymore. We can adapt this for fiction. We can take the parts of it that matter to us and that will sell and use it. And all of a sudden, things like the rapture become incredibly powerful motifs in books, in film, in song lyrics, and all of Christian subculture is suddenly seized with dispensational ideas without any dispensational academics behind them. And so it just becomes Looney Tunes. And nobody knows exactly what's happening anymore because there's no guiding principles. It's just whatever will sell, will sell. And now all of our theology is messed up because we all think all this stuff is in the Bible.
Yeah, I'm deeply struck by, as this academic divorce happens, how similar to the occurrences in American culture the dispensational milieu became. In two ways. The mid 20th century, first of all, is the height of the Cold War, and there is a constant anxiety about nuclear war and the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this shifts into the 60s and 70s when there is a time of rebellion. We're going to fight the power, bring down the man, and establish a new way of living. That is also, almost word for word, the story of the end of the world that pop dispensationalism was telling.
Yeah.
The world's going to end in chaos, and there's going to come a new world order established by Jesus. It was just a baptized reinterpretation of the culture story as much as it was a baptized reinterpretation of the dispensational story.
Oh, man. And I had never read Late Great Planet Earth until this moment where I'm like, okay, clearly this is a pivotal book. I need to read it in order to speak intelligently about it.
See, I would prefer to speak unintelligently about it, so I did not read it.
Oh, my gosh. It was so painful. I tell you what, because you're exactly right. As much as it claims to be interpreting scripture, in reality, it is interpreting social events. And it is buttressing his own opinions of social events through some cockamamie scheme of connecting all sorts of different verses and, making weird, lavish conclusions based on, well, this means this, and in the original language it has this kind of sense, and so that means it kind of means this, and then that means, and all of a sudden you're like, well, then clearly Gog means Russia. And you're like, whoa, how, okay, so now Russia is going to be the problem. And, similar on down the line through naming the Antichrist and all of, what is Africa going to do in the midst of all this and what's going to happen in Israel. And oh my gosh, it's nothing but trash, to be honest. Like it's in terms of exegeting the scriptures, it's not even close to academic rigor, discipline, careful study, or anything. It's just a whole lot of red string tied from verse to verse.
Absolutely. Well, and this is as I was talking with you about this recently, one of my major concerns is that the late great planet Earth is a great example of the credulity that comes about if we are not careful in our intake of information.
Yes.
We have to be very careful to not imbibe nonsense that claims to be truth. And you can get this exact kind of nonsense that Hal Lindsey spewed in the 70s. You can get it from plenty of YouTube preachers. You can get it from plenty of mainstream political pundits. You can get it from a host of places. And the problem is, it's incredibly entertaining. And so it's fun to listen to. And yet it trains us to think that we have thought deeply when in fact we've merely been entertained.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I mean, reading Hal Lindsey's book, I can see how easily somebody could fall for it because he is convincing in his like, I read this scripture and it means this, and if that means this. And then he refers to the original languages poorly, but he refers to the original languages. And so you're like, oh, well, he knows Greek and he knows Hebrew. He must know something. And then he says, well, and all of these biblical scholars agree, doesn't cite any of them, just says all. And so he's like, oh, you've read biblical scholars. Or he says, well, and so many biblical scholars have missed this detail, but those who have really studied prophecy understand it. And you're like, oh, good. I'm glad I'm finally talking to an expert. Right. And it's so insidious. Like it starts to just, you buy into it. And yet everything he's feeding is just nonsense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, and as we start to think about the book of Revelation, it's so easy to see why a systematized way of thinking would be able to be laid across the entire book of Revelation. It's so full of this sort of really captivating imagery. It is so obviously not just about what it's saying that it makes perfect sense to me that somebody would read this and go, please give me the interpretive grid. As a matter of fact, when we first read it, that's exactly what we said. That's why we started reading books, because we read this and we're like, yeah, I need somebody to walk me through this.
Right. Well, and I really appreciate Hummel at the end of his book, because he's saying, look, as dispensationalism really caught the imagination of most Americans, and the terminology and ways of thinking that it had in pop dispensationalism just wormed its way into every facet of our society, particularly all of our Christian subcultures. It created a system of thinking that is slowly being wound back, but there isn't yet a strong thing to come and capture everybody's imagination and replace it. There are promising pieces. And, I know that you're a big fan of N.T. Wright, and as am I, but I think you've read a lot of his, not end time stuff per se, but like his reinterpretation of like, no, this is what heaven is going to be like. And this is what it means when Christ is talking about coming in the new heaven and the new earth. And it's a much more biblically faithful interpretation than the leftovers of pop dispensationalism that have been handed to us.
Absolutely. Though I'll say, whether about Wright, who I am indebted to for much of what I think, or anybody else, one of the cautionary elements of reading this book for me has been hold your best theology loosely. Because your best theology today could be tomorrow's rejected dispensationalism.
Which is why I have really appreciated books like Reading Revelation Responsibly and some of the others that we've read, because what I find to be the salient takeaway from each of these books, and what they're encouraging us to take away from the book of Revelation, is what we take away from most books of the Bible. Two things. What does this teach us about God? And what does this teach us about how to live as God's people? And I don't get that from pop dispensationalism. In fact, like we said earlier, pop dispensationalism is focused on free grace. It's so easy. So the only appeal to how then shall we live, to borrow a phrase, from Hal Lindsey was basically at the very end, once he's scared you silly, then he's like, you don't want this to happen to you, do you? Well, you may as well get on your knees right now and ask for that free grace of Jesus. And then that's it. So how then shall we live? Become Christians.
Yeah, no, exactly. This is exactly the cycle that, I feel like I grew up in as a result of all of this. And it's so fascinating to see where it comes from. It's this cycle of all we have to focus on is getting people in the door and to pray the prayer, whatever the line is. Let's just get them across the line. But then it doesn't matter what they do after that because number one, grace is free. And number two, the rapture's coming any minute. So what we do in this world doesn't matter. So in the mid to late 1800s, it didn't matter how we responded to the questions of African Americans and slavery. In the 1900s, it didn't matter when how we responded to civil rights. It hasn't mattered how we respond to issues of the environment and things like that. None of those social or environmental issues are relevant in a world that starts with free grace and ends with the rapture.
Right. Right. And as we've already said, free grace is an oversimplification of what it means to be a Christian, and it is an unhelpful restriction of the definition. And then the rapture, we've mentioned that word a lot on this episode already. I have come to believe that the Bible doesn't even teach the rapture. It's not even a word that is used in Scripture, which is surprising to many, I'm sure. And so we don't have time to really define all of that. I found an amazing video that actually does a great job of going into why the rapture really isn't taught in the Bible. And
who's it by? Go ahead. Who's it by?
Sky Jathani.
It's a Holy Post video.
It is a Holy Post video.
I love it. I feel like I've mentioned the Holy Post a couple of times on this podcast.
Maybe a half a dozen or 666. But
it's great.
Yes, it is. And so anyway, I'm going to link that in the description. If you're like, wait a minute, the rapture is in the Bible. I know it's in the Bible. All right, look at this video and then comment on Facebook. Let me know what you think.
Yeah. And I will be honest, I am in the jury's out camp. I have really intentionally, as we've worked our way through the book of Revelation together throughout these various books, I have been intentional about asking, what is the book of Revelation trying to say?
Yeah.
And I have come down to believing that I don't think the book of Revelation is trying to address the end times. I think it is trying to paint a picture of spiritual realities that we should see ourselves in the midst of every day. And the tie-in of Revelation 2 and 3, those letters to the churches, is a way of grounding that imagery for its audience in the practical everyday realities of life.
Yes. And I think the graphic imagery of Revelation really pushes one to ask the question, so who are you going to follow? These strong, amazing beasts that everybody seems to follow that ultimately don't have the power that they think they do? Or are you going to follow the crucified lamb? One of these two will come out on top in the end.
Well, and to know, just so you know, following the crucified lamb, being one of the witnesses, means you could well get killed.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could have all the power in the world. That doesn't mean you choose to wield it to save your own life.
Yeah, exactly.
Through this study, the phrase, the crucified lamb, has become more and more central to my understanding of Christianity, as has the issue of crucifixion and suffering.
Yes. Along with this idea of witness. And witness seems to be the main word that comes out of many of these books that we've read and out of Revelation itself. And I almost would love to do a whole bonus episode on the book of Revelation where we really just kick around what does witness mean from the perspective of Revelation?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. I'd love to dig it through. For me, it's a question of what does witness mean then? And then I'm struck by what does witness mean for me now? How do I live my life in the shape of the shadow that the witnesses of Revelation cast?
Yeah, I love that question. What did that mean for them then, and what does it mean for us now? That's a that's a hermeneutic. That's a way of reading the Bible that I subscribe to.
Hmm.
And it does not appear to be relevant to pop dispensationalism. In other words, I don't think pop dispensationalists, and maybe not even actual dispensationalists, were asking that question. I think the
Certainly, yeah.
question, it just seems to be the question is, well, what does this mean now? Or what does this mean for the end times? How do we put all the pieces together? And I think they completely ignored the question, what did it mean then? And in light of that information, what does it mean now? I think that's a much more helpful set of questions.
I totally agree. Well, and this comes back to that simple literalism that we talked about that was essential to dispensationalism that inhibited them from asking, what type of writing is this book of Revelation? And therefore, what questions should we be asking of it? So, if you're not allowed to ask that, in any interpretation of Revelation, there are implicit questions. But if your leaders are telling you this is the plain, obvious way to read it, and you're not allowed to ask, well, are there other ways to read it? Then
Yes.
you're stuck reading it their way.
Yes. No, you're exactly right. I tell you what, at no point in Hal Lindsey's book did I read, here's what one scholar said about it. Here's what another scholar said about it. Here's how other groups of people think about it. And here's my conclusion based on these facts. No, at no point were alternative views entertained. It was just this means this, which means this, which means this, and therefore that. And it's like, whoa, you made 15 different leaps in 4 sentences and you didn't acknowledge any of them.
Yeah. I'm often caught by the simple old proverb, iron sharpens iron.
Hmm.
And I'm caught by the way in which when we choose to theologically isolate ourselves, we limit our ability to do that. There's a lot that dispensationalism had to offer to a broader conversation in its initial academic form. And if it had been able to engage.
Yeah, well, and that was one of the things that I was surprised to learn from Hummel's book. It seemed like dispensationalists isolated themselves and did not engage in the broader theological conversations. It was like, nope, we're just going to close ourselves off. This is what we believe. We're going to create institutions that teach what we believe, and that's just what we're going to do. And so there was no cross-pollinizing that was going on.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great image for it. Cross-pollinizing. One of the things I am deeply grateful for in postmodernity is that it has taught us a little bit of humility and taught us that our perspective is a perspective.
Sure.
And therefore, I can listen to other perspectives and acknowledge that they're perspectives too. And so maybe we can have a conversation about this. We've read books by Presbyterians and Baptists and all sorts of things in this. And I'm so grateful for the way in which they have offered us a really meaningful grid through which to read the book of Revelation.
100%. I kind of took on this study reluctantly. I was like, okay, I think I'm finally ready to study Revelation. I had no idea that I would actually fall in love with the book of Revelation as a result. And not the dispensational or pop dispensational understanding of Revelation, but the book itself and the things that it has to offer and teach us about God and about how to live as God's people. It is absolutely an amazing book.
Yes. And I am in the exact same space. I am so grateful for it. I have loved it. I have been thrilled that we have gotten to study it. I'm looking forward to our final conversation next week as we kind of explore this kind of one major theme of witness. But man, it has been so rich.
Yes, it has. So I want to just invite our audience. I thank you for traveling with us through these 5 books on Revelation and these conversations that we've had after reading them, I hope that if you haven't already, you will dive into the book of Revelation and read it for yourself. Bring along some helpful companions, maybe even read one or two of the books that we have read on this podcast, and enjoy this book. Enjoy learning about God from God's own revelation of himself, his kingdom, his reign, his rule, and his desperate desire to come and dwell with humanity. It is so good.
It absolutely is. But you know what's even better?
Well, nothing, but I'm assuming you're teeing up for a Witch Josh.
And speaking of the end times, this week's Witch Josh is Witch Josh died and went to heaven. Now, we don't know if it was before or after or including a rapture, but we know one of the Joshes died and went to heaven.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I either went to heaven or I met the guy in charge of the millennial reign. This guy could probably
Jesus. I
rule
believe
the
that's
world.
Jesus. I think that's why the word reign is in there.
Okay, well, probably. But okay, so this is me, Josh from Oregon. I died and went to heaven this week. One of my pastors took me, so it's fine. It's okay.
Yeah, it is.
So he knew of a bookstore out in Portland that is nothing short of amazing. And he's like, dude, you have to go. I can't believe you've never gone. Plus, I got to introduce you to my guy. This is like my book guy. And like other people have drug pushers, like he has a book pusher. And this guy was amazing. So if you ever get a chance, like I left that store and Josh, I thought you need to come to Oregon and we need to travel to Portland and we have to go to this bookstore. Arch's bookstore in Portland, Oregon is floor to ceiling, just old books shoved into bookcases. There's handwritten, like on a back of a piece of paper, like what these different categories are and just like tacked on there or taped on there. And it's all theology, like really good theology, really good philosophy, really good history, really good poetry, really good literature, great thinkers of the world, great thinkers of Christendom. It's all right there. And then the book dealer himself just probably knows everything. I was amazed at every person that came in and asked him some very specific question. And he was like, oh yeah. And he just like took them right to the thing, or he answered their question or talked intelligently about it. And it's like, are you kidding? And so I was actually looking for a particular book that was very niche. And I asked him about the book based on the last names of the two authors. I just said, do you have a Lo and Nida? And he said, oh yeah, the blah, 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 blah. And yeah, oh sure. I think so. I might've sold it. Let me go back in the back and check. Like, it was amazing. It was the best place I'd ever been in my entire life.
That's awesome. It sounds incredible.
It really is. It blows the pants off of Buc-ee's. So if your parents want a real vacation, they should come out to Portland.
I will bear that in mind.
Yes.
My parents would be thrilled beyond measure if I was like, hey guys, instead of coming to visit me, I'm sending you to my buddy Josh. You're just going to go see him. They'd kill me.
I hope they would bring baby pictures in every embarrassing story they probably could.
Oh man, yes, that they would do with great delight.
All right. Well, I think we should have another conversation next week, and we should make it about witness.
Let's do it. I can't wait.
What?
All right. Talk to you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Wait a minute. So, like, what's the car plan?